on this episode of Disruptive Discussions. You don't hear the voices inside your head, is that what you're telling me?
Well, our perceptions of reality and things that we do and how we learn, and
it's a concept called strategic culture, and basically you want to approach people from their perspectives. This group of students in this Peruvian forest, like
What the university was, should be, and what it is are three very different things.
we've been friends for a decade.
yeah. The only part I have a hard time with, I sometimes just ramble, and then I kind of just run out of stuff to say, and I'm like, all right, carry on.
All right, speaking of other
Somebody
things,
keep going. Yeah, or point me in a direction.
true facts, man.
Yeah, but I learn best by like, it's kind of annoying, but I think really well when I talk stuff out. I don't know if you guys are the same way.
Oh, yeah.
Like,
For sure.
when I talk things out loud, like things just like solidify for me more. Or like I was telling you about like cryptocurrency and Bitcoin the other day. It made me realize like what I thought I understood, I actually really did not understand.
Well, I think part of that effect is always when you go to teach someone else about something, when you have to explain things to someone who doesn't understand, you understand how much you yourself do not, in fact, understand.
Yeah.
Yep.
I think it's just the teacher versus student thing.
Yeah.
Because we all run into that too.
Yeah.
Well, and to your point of like talking things out, I might be weird for this, but like I will sometimes just go on a drive and I'll have like a conversation with myself almost. Not a crazy person, Gollum kind of conversation.
Like driving past a police officer, you're just like sitting there like twitching, like talking to yourself. Like,
Yeah, I'm not clapping flies out of the air, imaginary or anything like that. But what I'll do is I'll kind of go on a drive, and then I'll start to think about things in my life, and often that'll have to do with education and dating and future and just questions that I have that I haven't quite figured out, and I'll just kind of vocalize it. And I think we've had this discussion before, but sometimes, especially when you're just kind of on your own, I like to just vocalize the things in my mind, like, okay, I'm worried about this, I'm thinking about that, here's kind of the possibilities. And it's almost like making a map in your mind. Like the power of vocalization is really cool. And that's one of the things that I like about this podcast, like I've said, is you kind of discover by speaking, and it's a powerful tool.
I agree. Well, it's like, I think that's why, like therapy works so well for a lot of people, is because it's just like all this stuff that you build up in your head sometimes. Like when you define it, or when you talk to someone, or you just say it out loud, it becomes more concrete and more like tolerable, or like it feels like you can, because I feel like when you get in your head sometimes it's like it feels like the world is ending, or but when you like talk it out with someone, it usually helps a lot.
I never thought of it that way. That's very true.
Yeah.
Well, I always I do the same thing. It's either in the car or I'll start pacing. I pace a lot when I've got the open space, but I always felt weird about it until we had discussed it and found out that other people do it. Plus, when I was reading, because every so often I'll read Managing Oneself again by Peter Drucker.
Yeah.
Which is just a good reminder of how people learn and giving yourself a little bit more of an orientation on what to focus on and stuff like that. But I guess he does the same thing, and he was saying like, hey, people learn in different ways. People are readers or they're listeners. Decide which one you are. Go for your strengths on that one. He gave some cool examples on like different presidents that learned and talked in different ways. I think Eisenhower and Roosevelt were two of the big ones he talked about that were so starkly contrasting in which one was a listener versus a writer.
Yeah.
And like the way they would take their press conferences was weird, because when one president really loved being a listener, and people would just like 5 minutes before the meeting or the press conference, they'd come up and tell him what questions they were going to ask.
Yeah.
He'd have a beautiful answer laid out and everything. But the next president that came in, that was just like, he was a writer for sure. Mm-hmm. If he didn't have all the questions in writing, which I think was it Eisenhower? He was a general in World War II.
Yeah, he was.
That seems right. Yeah. So as a general, when he was doing war press releases, every time they would go to do a new conference, people would give him stuff in writing and said, these are what the press will ask you. And he had pristine answers.
Yeah.
But as soon as he followed Roosevelt as a president, then everyone would start just a couple minutes before. They'd go, hey, they're going to ask about this, this, and this. And he'd go, hold on. Where's my list? And people dogged him for it. They were like, man, he doesn't know what he's saying. He just kind of trips over his words, doesn't answer the question.
It's just different. Everyone does it
yeah,
differently.
and Drucker goes, hey, it's because they didn't know that they were readers and listeners. Yeah. So it's a good thing to watch out for. And one way people get around that, like big CEOs he knows, they will gather their, chief executive officers around the conference table, and they'll just talk at them. They don't need the input. They just need an audience in order to talk at, or others will just talk to themselves, and it's just how they learn.
Yeah, it's super weird. I know one of our teachers in the Chi program, Matt Barrett, he used to work for the president's like daily brief, where, they basically get like all the nation's like top critical information and give it to the president. But he said that like each president would have like a different style that they would want to get briefed by. So like some presidents really liked having like somebody there tell them what the information was. Other presidents liked it, like I think Obama liked it just in quick bullet points. Like other presidents like to read like a couple paragraphs. It was like different for each one, which I thought was like super interesting. But if you're the most powerful person in the world, you gotta map to whatever their learning style is, man.
Better know.
Like
that's cool. That's cool to see that in action, actually.
Yeah. Well, that reminds me, like, so a few different thoughts. Like, I remember hearing a while ago that people, about, I think 50% of people have an internal monologue, and the other half do not. And other people are not aware that the other group exists. And I don't know if you guys have heard of this one before.
I think so.
The idea of the internal monologue is that people hear, like, people's thoughts come to them as like a voice that's just talking. Like it's just kind of like they're monologuing kind of their voice or their thoughts. Mm-hmm. And other people, they just kind of have these subconscious thoughts. Yeah. I don't really have an internal monologue. That's why I have to like vocalize the things that I think.
What do you mean you don't have an internal voice? You can't hear your own voice inside your head?
No.
Like I'm sure you could.
What do you mean?
If you like deliberately, so when you like deliberately think about like your voice inside your head, you can probably hear it. But like normally thinking, you probably don't, right?
Yeah,
I'm the same way.
Like for me, I can't just like map it out in my mind. I have to. Yeah, I have. That's why I have to vocalize. That's why I have to go in my car and just talk, because then it becomes concrete. But otherwise, you didn't know about this, Nelson.
No, I did not know the people can't hear their own.
No.
What do you mean?
No, there's no, because it's like an internal.
Well, do you do that?
I don't hear an internal voice when I think. No.
No.
What do you hear?
Yeah, it's just thoughts. I don't hear anything.
I just have.
I don't like understand.
It's this abstract kind of idea of like happy, sad.
I mean, I can think without words, but I typically think in speech.
Well, I don't know if it's just like it's just abstract ideas. It's not like I'm forming sentences in my mind to think about something. It's just
see that's what I mean. I can think like that, but I often don't always think like that. I think as a person inside my head speaks. He speaks my thoughts. You don't have that voice.
No. Well,
you don't hear the voices inside your head. Is that what you're telling me?
well, no. So like I can turn it on. Like if I'm focused on like, okay, I want to hear a voice inside my head. Like my mind, when I think, my mind will play the voice and I'll be able to hear the voice. But like just normally thinking, it's like I don't have a version of me talking to myself whenever I think a thought. Like
interesting.
See,
and it's not like I always do that.
Okay.
It flabbergasted me.
So here's another one. I actually, there's a lot we could talk about on this topic. It's actually super interesting. So that's like the whole idea behind like speed reading is what they call like subvocalization. So like a lot of times when people read, they'll have the voice that like reads to them in their head. That's like a real audio that they hear. But the key to speed reading is that like you basically want to take the words that you see and just translate it directly into thought without having to go through the translation of like saying the words in your head and then translating it into thought. You just go straight from seeing the words to thought.
Oh yeah, no, that makes sense to me.
Yeah, okay.
I could only imagine trying to read words and then picture that would be awful. That makes sense to me.
I don't even think I have an internal monologue when I read words.
Yeah,
I don't see, and I definitely don't when I read words.
Okay, good.
No,
Yeah,
when I'm
yeah.
trying
But a
to
lot of
read a
people
novel,
do, though, I
the
think.
last thing I need is another voice in my head. Sally did that. No, that's the last thing that happens.
But like if you look down and read something though, like you can like if I tell you to like look at a book and read it in my voice internally,
I could
you
do
can
that.
do it. Yeah.
Yeah.
But like normally you don't read in any voice. It's just that's just thoughts.
Yeah,
but I
you
think a
just
lot of
read.
people do have that internal voice that they like translate through when they read.
Interesting.
Yeah.
See, and that's okay. That's weird.
Isn't that weird?
Maybe that's what you're referring to.
I mean, maybe it's not weird. Maybe it's normal.
It's weird.
I
Maybe
think
it's normal.
I think
but
it's
it
like
just
I think it's a
doesn't-
pretty normal thing. We just don't realize that other people don't do it like that.
It's one of those like weird like is my purple your purple kind of concepts, you know? Like like do you see the same colors I see? Do you feel the same pain I do, or is it just me? Like
Yeah. It's just all a simulation.
Matrix, my boy.
One of the weird things I heard was like some people. So when I say picture a red apple, like when you see that in your mind, do you literally see the red apple?
Yes. Why would I not?
kind of, yeah. Like I picture just like kind of like a
Like you can see it though. You see an image, right?
yeah. It's got like
Yes.
the Getty Images
Yeah,
watermark. You
yeah,
know,
okay.
like-
But you can see something. I've heard there is a small subset of people that like they conceptualize it, but they don't really like see anything.
They don't have the mind's eye. That's weird.
that is weird. Yeah,
Isn't that weird? Like they know what you're talking about. Like it's like, oh yeah, an apple, but like they don't see anything when they think about it. It's just like conceptually they just know it's an apple.
That's very strange.
Weird, eh?
I don't know. Well, dude, you and I were having this conversation the other day about how we conceptualize time.
Oh,
This was a
dude.
trip for
Oh
me.
my
Spalding, we're going to
gosh.
run a real-time test and
Yeah.
see if this happens for you too.
Yeah. Oh my
Okay.
gosh.
So, I want you to picture, how do you picture weeks?
weeks.
Yes.
Like as you're going through your week, do you like visualize the week?
Yeah. Do you have any type of visualization for what a week looks like? A week, or for me it's 2 weeks.
A week. Like it almost feels like a bar or a ruler or something like that I'm like filling up, where it's like
Okay.
or it's like, oh, Thursday. Like you almost picture some kind of like glasses like half or 2/3 full or something like that, where it's
Okay.
like crap. Like
Yeah.
end of the week feels like I'm done, and then Monday feels like you're restarting the bar, or you're like refilling up the cup or something.
Okay.
Is that normal?
What happens when you are, let's say you have next Thursday is something. What does that look like? Do you just make a longer bar? What does it become?
Like do you conceptualize anything?
Kind of. Like, I mean, I think maybe it's like. I guess if it depends on what the thing is. If it's a really like valuable thing, if I'm going on like vacation, my bar elongates to when I start the vacation. So then it's like I have 10 days to fill up before
This is
X
awesome.
moment.
Okay, interesting. See, the way I do it is I have my conceptualization of time starts in a 2-week format, and it creates a little oval like this with the weekends at each cap.
Okay.
Does that make
What
sense?
the heck?
So I got a Sunday, and then you have all of your days going all the way around, and then you have another Sunday on the other side.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how I visualize my weeks. And I can always visualize if I need to skip ahead like 3 weeks, it just seems to
wraps
keep
around.
going around and around and around. But then when I elongate that out to more of like a yearly type thing, that 2 weeks turns from a flat 2-dimensional image into a spiral all the way down. So I can, if I need to look back at 2017, I spiral all the way down through the weeks and months into May of 2017. Does that make sense?
Kind of.
And it's just like the bar. It just keeps getting longer
Yeah.
as you go up and up through the spiral. And that's just what it looks like. If I need to conceptualize what does next Thursday look like, I pull up my little 2-dimensional image of what a 2-week period looks like. I see a little green mark on next Thursday spot, and then I can open that up, and that looks like a day, and I can see my day, and it's all conceptualized in images within that little spiral.
It's one of those things that you like subconsciously create. Because mine, when we were talking, ours were like really eerily similar.
It was
really weird.
mind-boggling. I couldn't even.
So mine is the same way where I see things in like 2-week cycles, So it's like I'm going in more of like a chutes and ladder type of thing where I'm like wrapping around like that. And so it's like Wednesday's like the middle long side, but then when we get to the weekend, it's like a corner, we turn around and then we go back the other way.
Yeah, when you drew that, I was like, why would you do it that way? That is so weird.
Yeah, it's so weird. But it's like one of those things that I think everybody kind of has their own way of thinking of time.
It's not something I would have thought about before.
Like, who's gonna like ask like, how do you visualize time? Like, it's such a weird question. So my weeks are like that, and then my years are kind of the same way, where they don't do the chutes and ladders pattern. They're just a normal like oval, but that'll be so summers. It's in 2-year cycles. Summers are on the long side, and then on the corners are the winter times. And then it'll do another summer, and then winter time, and then summer, and it'll just keep going and going in 2-year cycles. Is that screwed up or what?
That is so
but
interesting.
As a byproduct of that, though, like I have like a crazy good memory of like when things occurred like throughout my life. Like I can tell you like years pretty easily. Sometimes I can tell you like the day of the week certain events happened. Because it's just like, I'll remember where I am in my week, you know?
Mm-hmm. Just that conceptualization kind of like...
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's super weird. Because it's like, you know? Anyway, we wanted to ask you about that because we were having this conversation of like, how do we conceptualize time? And, you know, we were like, what the heck?
Wait,
like,
why?
I'm sure this is one of those things that like everybody does, but it's like, well, like nobody talks about it because it's like, there's no reason
it's
to
just
talk
not
about
a
how
question that you would ask
time.
someone. Yeah.
Well, it's so funny. Like sometimes you just have these kind of assumptions about life, about things that you do that are normal, and that can be ways that you think and perceive the world, you know, and that can go from that to like just ways that you just do things that you assume like everyone else does the same way. And I think you really learned, like, when you live with other people, that's when you kind of see, like, oh, people do that. Like, that's kind of weird. Like, my roommate, like, will eat cereal dry. Just with a spoon, though.
Whoa.
And it's kind of like things
on.
like that, where it's like, I guess people
We have
that.
psychopaths among us.
I guess that, okay, I'm glad I'm not the only one.
The real question is, how do they pour their cereal?
What do you mean now?
Well, some people... Now, these are the psychopaths. They pour the milk first, and then they...
Incorrect way. Let it be known that is wrong.
That is objectively false.
That's pretty messed up if you do that. Well, I guess he eats the cereal dry, so he doesn't pour any milk, but it's kind of funny, though.
So, in this regard, I wanted to kind of pivot a little bit in this discussion, because we're speaking a little bit about, like, our perceptions of reality and things that we do and how we learn and etc. And there's a lot of things we have taken for granted. I have been amazed at how much culture defines what we understand. Like the way that we're raised and the culture we come up in largely defines a lot of our values and how we perceive things. And I think I've told you guys this before. Just as background, I lived in Sierra Leone, it's a country in West Africa. I lived there for 2 years as a religious missionary, and it was a great opportunity for me to kind of understand a different culture that's not northern Utah. But it was so interesting. I would talk to people, and I would ask them how their day was. And so I'd be like, you know, I talk to people all the time every day, and I would go up and like, how's your day been going? How are you? And no one ever said good. Never once did anyone say good. And at first I was like, what are they like, why not? Like, when I ask you how your day is, I'm asking you to describe it. Is it good or is it bad? Like, rate it on a scale.
How you doing, man?
Yeah. But people would always describe it as, like, thank God, or tell God tanky, as they would say. And so it was more of a question of fate. And they viewed it as more of, like, the day is neither good or bad, but it is just attributed to God. God is the one deciding. And that is such a foreign concept to me. I couldn't get people to rate their days as far as good or bad because they had an interesting idea about fate and design and God in that context. And so I think that culture and where we're brought up can also just completely change our internal monologues, our way of perceiving the world, our conceptualization of things. It's really amazing how much of an impact that makes.
Yeah. It's a weird thing because so in one of my classes we talk, and I've talked to you guys about this all
I love
the
this
time.
example.
Yeah, it's a concept called strategic culture, and basically you approach things, you want to approach people from their perspectives, because we all subconsciously as a society have different goals depending on what society we grew up in. Like America's very like career and work focused and hustle and focused and stuff like that, where other countries are different. But the one example that I really like is one, it was with like a group of like students touring the National Monument in Washington D.C. And they were at the Washington Monument, and the American tour group, their questions to the tour guide were always, well, like, how tall is it? And that was kind of where the questions ended. It was, how tall is it? And, they'd go on their day. Oh, cool. I don't know. I don't know how tall it is, but, give them an answer and they'll move on, go see the next thing. Well, so here's the funny thing. So when you bring a bunch of, I think the next tour group was a bunch of like French students, first question they ask is like, why the heck is it an obelisk in Washington?
Oh, it's funny.
And it was funny because we were in one of our classes when the professor asked us that question, like all of us, like I think without fail, like all of us pretty much agreed, like the question we would ask first off, right off the bat naturally, is just like, yeah, how tall is the thing? Like, I don't know what else you ask. But then like the idea of like, well, yeah, I guess that's a little weird that it's an obelisk in Washington. Like, why is it an obelisk, But it's that concept of like your culture, the way you grew up, the way your surroundings are, like it's not enough to be aware that there's other cultures because you're blind to questions you could be asking that you don't know to ask.
It just seems obvious to us Americans that a stately building looks like an obelisk. That is what an official building looks like.
Yeah.
When you see that little conical shape, you're like, yeah, that's a big boy building right there. Uh-huh. Well,
Yeah.
I just want to measure it. I want to know how big it is.
Yeah.
And other people are like, hey, so like who designed it? Or why is it that way? That's kind of a cool way to do things. And we're like,
yeah.
What do you mean cool? That's just how it is.
Yeah.
I love that example that you had.
Well, it was so funny because it was so telling. Like the whole class, like literally, like we all had the same thought of the first question to ask, which was, how tall is it? Mm-hmm. That was like uniformly across the board. That was our very first just gut instinct question to ask, which I thought was really interesting.
Well, and that's where you get to Americans specifically. And I've got another example to share kind of from where I was when I was living abroad. Mm-hmm. And I've shared this with you guys before, but a very unfortunate reality in those very undeveloped parts of the world is that there is a lot of death and there's a lot of medical problems and there's just not a lot of access to clean water and doctors and safe food and that kind of thing. And there's a deadly strain of malaria that's worse than most other parts of Africa in Sierra Leone. And so I knew people that died frequently. I would see people one day and pass them, and then the next 2 or 3 days later, they'd be dead. And it was really heartbreaking and sad. But I was always taken by the different interpretation of death from people from Sierra Leone as opposed to me. So sometimes I'd pass up by a house and I'd be like, oh, where's that granny that was sitting outside the other day? And they would say, well, she died. And I would ask, like, well, what happened? Like, that's terrible. What? And they would just say, oh, she was sick. And they didn't really know what happened and they didn't really care. Like, it didn't matter. She's dead. Like, that's what matters, is that she passed away, and that's that. Like, knowing what happened doesn't matter. But for me, as an American, like, I had to know. I have to quantify what happened. How did it occur? Like,
yeah.
Like, what sickness did she get sick of, and how was she infected, and how can we prevent this? And that's not just like some kind of public health standpoint, but I think that really comes down to like Westerners and how we, especially Americans, how we're just focused on quantifiable evidence and how much and why.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. So there's another story that I heard. It was of a USU tour group in Peru. Or not a tour group. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
It was like a I don't know what you call it. Like they go there, they fly over there to like help businesses start up. I don't know what
Was it
that's
with
called.
the seed
Seed?
program?
Yeah, seed program.
Yeah, they go in as entrepreneurial consultants, I think is what you could call them.
Yeah, I think it was something like that. So basically, they went to like this Peruvian village, and they helped this guy. You know, he was a fisherman. They helped him like set up like all these different fish traps and stuff along this river. Basically, like load him up. You know, like he's gonna go catch a bunch of fish. He's gonna be able to sell all this fish, provide like for everyone. And like a few nights went by, and they went back, and like all the fish traps had been like ruined and like disabled, and so they were like, what the heck is going on? Somebody's like rigging these fish traps. We're gonna find out who it is. And so they do like a stakeout or something, or they find out, I can just see like this group of students in this Peruvian forest, like, all right, who's messing up these traps, man? Yeah. Anyways, it's this fisherman that they helped. He came to disable his own fishing traps, and they confronted him about it. They were like, what on earth are you doing? Like, we set these up for you. You're like ready to make bank. Like, you're going to be set for life, And he's like, and he kind of told him, I guess in their culture, when you are in more abundance of things, when you're wealthier or when you have like a lot of stuff, all of your family and like all of your village expects you to like provide for everyone. And so it's actually like this big burden to have like all of these resources. And so he went and disabled his own fishing traps to make it so he didn't have to do that, which is just crazy. Like, as Americans, like, this USU group was just dumbfounded at the idea. Like, why would you want to do that? Like,
why wouldn't you want to make as much profit as possible?
Yeah.
That's just the right answer, is it not? Capitalism.
Yeah, exactly.
As long as we're on this type of topic, actually, I do want to go back to something that we'd been more casually discussing last week, which was just, I was very pleased by kind of the preliminary discussions that we had. Spalding, you're kind of uniquely placed to have some really good insights on this sort of thing.
He's got some experience that we don't have.
Firsthand for 10% some of his entire life lived out in Africa.
Yep.
Which I don't know. You think of it that way. It really is though. 2 out of 20 something.
Almost 10% of my life I spent out there. Yeah.
Nearly. Yeah.
Oh my heck, that is nuts when you think of it
that
weird. Way.
You start putting it in ratios. Yeah. But like, so I'll lay just a quick groundwork for the 2 questions that I had, because we were talking a little bit about not just the cultural development, but also the economic development of places like Africa, and maybe some reasons on why Africa, of all places, seems to be one of the few continents lagging behind the rest as far as modernization goes. And I kind of wanted to break it into 2 different sections, because I feel like there's maybe 2 different answers to this question. Is like, how did they become kind of set back in the first place, and why do they continue to be set back in a modern world, if that makes sense? Because I did a little bit of digging into some more historical stuff, which is something I might have a bit more of confidence talking about, but I know having more of the modern answer is probably much more along your lines. So I was curious to see what kind of starting thoughts you had on that sort of thing. I'm sure you've got a lot there, actually.
Yeah. Well, and I have to confess, I am not I'm not an expert in a lot of that stuff. Most of my experience came just from kind of living on the ground and just kind of walking around and seeing the way that people lived. I didn't have a huge impact or insight into the history, but I know a lot of it comes down to colonialism, and that's something that's pretty well discussed. Is this idea that there were these European powers that were technologically a little bit more advanced, and they took advantage of the raw resources of a lot of now underdeveloped countries or less developed countries. And that is, a lot of sub-Saharan Africa, and as well as a lot of South America. You have these just powers that kind of colonized, and they weren't really as focused on developing the areas that they were in and investing in those regions, but it was more of a focus of taking their natural resources out, and using that for the betterment of the home country, I guess. And that's a pretty indisputable fact. That's kind of how things were run. I think up until really post World War II, when a lot of those countries, especially in Sub-Saharan Africa, India, etc., became independent. And so that's where a lot of it began. And then there's this idea that colonialism has continued, but in a different sense. It's like this neo-colonialism, where instead of having a an official government presence that is siphoning maybe raw materials and doing some token infrastructural development, it's now corporations, or it's now just an unbalanced cycle of trade in which you'll have higher powers, Western powers, trading raw resources and selling back manufactured goods at higher prices. And that is the kind of the cycle that's been discussed, where it keeps a lot of those less developed countries less developed because they're not really manufacturing anything. They're just taking the raw resources out, and it makes the richer countries richer because they just keep getting these cheap raw natural resources. So that's kind of the idea. I hope that answers your thoughts there.
I really think it does. That was a really nice summary, I think, of kind of, we had started to maybe beat around the bush a little bit, a little bit the other night. And I think it was great to start that way, though, because it started very much with a question of, I'm trying to remember how we even opened that discussion. I think it came about something along the lines of, we happened to notice the fact that, or bring up the fact that Africa had lagged behind so much, and it was probably an extension of one of your stories or something like that. And we went on this tangent, and because I remember when you started talking about the modernization of how different corporations have been utilizing resources from Africa, but not devoting those resources back into the economies from which they come. I think that was a very difficult concept at first for me to understand, and I remember I just kept having to ask questions about why that might be. I don't know. I think it was just a bit of an eye-opening conversation for me. I tried doing a little bit of homework into why that might have been the case in the first place, and I think this is the one thing that made me try to divide the two questions, or the one question, into two, because I had read Jared Diamond's book, Guns, Germs, and Steel, which is obviously one of the really big books that's commonly referenced for how civilizations rise and fall, why they succeeded, as far as our historical context comes from. And I went back through it just at least to summarize it and try to discover some of the better reasons why Europe was kind of the dominating power through up until the 18th century, after the British Empire started to fall apart and everything. Once oh boy.
You got this.
Colonialization.
There we have it.
That's a big word, ladies and gentlemen.
Day, man.
It's a tough one. Audience, try saying it. It's not as easy as it sounds.
Say it 3 times fast, my guy. I don't know. And of course, his whole book came down to the domestication of certain types of animals, something like 14 out of 16 of kind of your classic horses, sheep, cattle, ox, pigs, that sort of thing. They're all from the Eurasia part of the continent, to the point where places like South America had like alpacas, some llamas maybe, but it just the ability to domesticate animals, to create domestic,
like agriculture, wasn't that
agricultural
like a big part?
products, to the point where you could have societies that weren't reliant on more of a hunter-gatherer type existence, where they could gather in large quantities as people combine their resources, start to specialize, that sort of thing. And I think, and then after that, obviously, once you have big groups of people together, you create germs. I give up. It's one of those nights.
Well, what were you trying to say? Contagion or something?
Contagions.
Oh.
Yes. Goodness. English. Anyway, you create a whole new host of contagions. The whole population gets used to them. Yeah. Everyone knows that story of how the Spanish and the Portuguese went into South America, basically wiped out the Incan empires just with viruses alone, that sort of thing. But I think that was the summary of his book, of understanding why Europe itself had such a leg up on other parts of the country, or other parts of the world. And you had big forces like China that ended up doing their own thing in the East because they had rice and their own set of different animals that they were able to do that with. And then obviously they had the Silk Road and trade routes with India and Europe. So they developed a lot better than certain areas. But these two specific areas, like Africa and Australia with the Aboriginals, these two specific continents that never really seemed to have any of those things as a leg up to start with, and now in a modern society where we've got, like you were saying, all of these different corporations that have an interest in utilizing the resources that were in those countries, but not really providing the system an opportunity to give resources back to those economies. I don't know, but it seemed like a very telling story to me.
Yeah. Well, and it just kind of reminds me of how much of a difficulty it is. I mean, we've discussed a little bit about poverty, and I firmly believe poverty is not a natural state of the world. And I've brought that up with you. And obviously, there's always higher and lower kind of ranks economically. But I think the large swaths of poverty, entire continents that are just living on the bare minimum and barely able to get by, entire countries where there's essentially no economic opportunities except for the 0.1%. That is not a natural occurrence. That is not, I believe, a healthy or a natural thing that should exist within a society. I don't even think that it's existed this bad in comparison to the rest of humanity ever. I think it's a problem that's kind of been exacerbated. So it's definitely something that needs to be kind of delved into. I remember when I was living in Sierra Leone, I found probably just a handful of people that I would consider well literate, that could read a sentence or read a book and really understand it. And obviously, at first, it gives you the impression, man, these people aren't really thinking through stuff. And then you realize that it is rooted in a lack of educational systems, and things like that perpetuate. And so it's interesting from a Western perspective. You look at it and you're like, well, just dig yourself out of that hole. But it's a lot different when you come from an environment where there is no education. There is no access to, how are you going to learn to read if your parents don't know how to read and you can't afford to go to school? And so I think some of these systems get kind of continued, or some of this poverty continues, both because
cycle.
As a cycle, and also because of the nature of other countries and their relation.
See, I remember one of my original answers, or at least kind of my hip fire solutions, if you want to call it that, was time fixes all. And it certainly seems that over the past probably century at the very least, the world as a whole has risen out of mass poverty at a rate probably unmatched by any other period within human history. Yeah. So as a world, we're doing incredibly, incredibly well. But obviously there's some parts that lag behind more than you'd probably expect them to, given the modernization rate of the rest of the world. And I think that is where you caught me kind of off guard when we had that other conversation, is where I was like, you're right. It's kind of, maybe we've got some factors here that haven't really been taken into consideration. I tried looking up instances of where people had tried to solve that problem, and I had a hard time finding something that had lasted very long. I kept running into situations where, I remember one specifically where it was a well-renowned economist, I think, and I don't remember his name. I wish I'd actually written it down, but he was some sort of prize-winning economist. He worked with a lot of different charities and universities here in the States, and his whole objective was to select X number of poor villages within Africa, spread them out over the entire continent, and try and do some sort of test to see what would happen if we injected X number of resources into each one and how each one would respond. And they took billions worth of dollars and built roads, schools, infrastructure. They did all of these sorts of things within these small communities, tried to give them everything they might need as far as infrastructure and resources, money, to be able to succeed. And inevitably, the result that most of them came up with was, well, this one little area seemed to do really, really well for a while. But the problem is that they would do well, so everyone else from around them moved in as well, because they wanted a part of the action.
Oh.
But all of a sudden, that left, where this small village used to be surrounded by some other smaller villages, everything became conglomerated into one large area, but people didn't know how to really manage that sort of thing really well. So when the resources started to dry up, when they should have been learning to propel this type of...
It's the teach a man to fish, he's set for life. Or sorry, I said that back. It's the if you give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish, you feed him for life. It's the same type of concept where you're basically you gave this village a fish, but they didn't know how to catch another one. So when all the other villages or whatever came and gathered around, they ran out of resources and they just didn't have the knowledge to keep it going.
Well, and a big part of that was that no one went back to what they were going to do before or had a backup plan or anything. It just was reliant on kind of this external system.
Yeah.
So as soon as the experiment started to end, this thing that had started out as a good thing turned into kind of the slums area, and people didn't have what they needed to go back to some sort of more rural organization, that sort of thing, what they had done before, something that might work a little bit better than what they were doing now. It drew everyone in, and then it just kind of dropped them, if that makes sense. So
yeah,
I'm just curious. If I see so many examples like that where people set out with good intentions, but it doesn't really come out with good results, what should we do? And maybe I, as a little, as a 20-something-year-old American, maybe I shouldn't do anything. But if I did, what would actually be helpful? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, and to that point, like, it's so much easier to point out problems with the way that we try to help people help other countries develop, and it's a lot harder to come up with like actual solutions. I mean,
that's exactly why I asked, because I don't know.
We are talking from a very skewed.
Self-admittedly, for sure.
It almost feels like we shouldn't even attempt to address these issues because we are just so far removed from everything. Well, except with your instance where you lived there for 2 years.
That's exactly. That's why I said, maybe I should just shut up and not even.
I mean, I don't know.
Pay attention to it,
but,
or maybe the opposite is true. Maybe someone like me should be involved in the solution.
Even
I just
as ignorant as we are, we're discussing it to the best of our ability. It's disruptive discussions. I mean,
we're disrupting the status quo here. No, like, I mean, I think a lot of it comes down. I mean, if you win the lottery, most people that win the lottery don't, appropriately invest it, and it's not telling about them. It's just that it's not a sustainable source of income, and so it eventually just kind of leaves. And I think that in all things with investment, and especially with helping countries develop, it has to focus on sustainability. And I've brought this up before with you guys. There's this idea that we have expectations for developing countries that are unrealistic. And so there are certain policies and institutions that all really like developed economies seem to have. They all have a centralized bank. They generally promote free trade, if you look at that. And a lot of them have, social welfare. So, workers' compensation. They have safety nets in that way. Like if you're, in westernized countries, we feel like you shouldn't starve to death. That's probably something we don't want people to have to do. But in a lot of these developing countries, they don't have the wherewithal to really put together an effective central bank, to have a functioning democracy. Or at least it's not very easy yet, or, to have a lot of that welfare programs or to have free trade. Sometimes it takes more time for them to develop. One of the problems is that a lot of international institutions, the World Bank, etc., seem, from kind of the things that I've consumed, I might be wrong in saying this, but it seems like the expectations are unrealistic. It took America and a lot of Western Europe 100 years or so from the time they started developing to really get these institutions, to get a solid.
And then we had a civil war.
Yeah, and then we had a civil war. I mean, we were patient with ourselves because we were, the United States was really one of the first to get it.
Yeah, the United States had the advantage of we were just so far removed from the rest of the world that, we have two oceans to defend us. Like, if any outside influence wanted to mess with us, they had to cross an ocean. So we had that to our advantage, but I think that's that just plays a small role, but it just shows that there's a multitude of factors that have to go into something like that.
Well, and exactly. I mean, there's a lot of factors, and sometimes you'll have organizations that offer aid, but they offer it under the condition that you must develop a working central bank, and you must have these welfare programs in place. And I think it just takes time. I mean, a lot of these countries haven't been they've only been independent for what, 50, 60 years or so. It took the US, 150 years or so to really become an economic powerhouse. And so, while obviously the path is a little bit more well trodden now, I think that, the pathway to industrialization, it's unique for each country. And it's something that it takes time. It takes a lot of effort. So that's a little bit of thoughts, but I don't have any real solutions to global problems.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it is really interesting though, because yeah, you just see such a diverse range of the quality of life between, I mean, you have the United States that it's like, I like never ever has it even crossed my mind like where my next meal's coming from,
Mm-hmm.
like to even like think about that is like, what the heck, like that's kind of weird to think about, but that's a very real thing for a lot of people in the world. And to have that diverse of a I don't know what you call it, that diverse of an experience is just super weird, especially with all of like the technology and the advancement that we've made as humanity.
It is, yeah. Well, and it even reminds me, I have an old friend, an old religious leader that I knew. He was a bishop, for those that are familiar, for me. And so I was very close with him. He was a great man, but I've been communicating a little bit with him. And he recently told me that he's been taking online school through a church program, trying to get his bachelor's degree, and his computer broke. And there is no other option to buy computers. He can't find another one. I'm not even sure where he got his own. And so he's asking me to send him a computer. It's not an option. There's really no internet. There's not really any other places to go get one. And he doesn't have the wherewithal to purchase one. And so, like you're saying, Caden, it's amazing how different the experiences are of people in different circumstances. And it's not really, their fault. It's not, he's not industrious enough. He just does not have the capability and the tools to buy a computer. And so it's just, I wish I knew how to fix it, but
yeah, no, that would suck to, yeah, you got one computer, and if your one computer breaks, so like they don't have internet though, right? So how is he taking classes?
I don't know for sure. He might have been spending his time at the church because,
okay.
For those that aren't familiar, I serve my mission with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and there's actually a lot of really great programs that the church does to try to help development, kind of from bottom up kind of ways. And so this is one. There's a program called Pathway, where you can do an online university kind of degree, very cheap, and it's a little bit cheaper for those in situations like my bishop who can't afford American prices for schooling. But that's one, and the church buildings themselves actually have Wi-Fi, and so I'm not sure how he got a hold of a computer, but he did have access to Wi-Fi, I think, from there. It's called the Perpetual Education Fund, where there are some people that loans are given, small loans are given to those that are trying to go to college to help pay for college, and then they're paid back over time afterwards. And so I think he had Wi-Fi there, but it's just really hard because it's hard to have the wherewithal to really get in a starting place to begin with.
Well, so I wonder. Here's my question. So he's doing like this like bachelor's program, right? How much of that knowledge is like realistically applicable over there? Because I feel like here you can really get away with at college learning a bunch of really like abstract conceptual stuff that's like, okay, yeah, this is how the world works in a very conceptual theoretical way. You go to chemistry and it's like, oh yeah, here's how atoms are, and oh cool, that's how stuff works. But when like the rubber meets the road, it's like when you go into the workforce or when you have to like actually use stuff in life to produce whatever it is to make money, that's a very different like skill set. You know what I mean? Do you see what I'm saying? Whereas like a lot of my classes in school is like, it's the very high level, like, oh, what does a good leader look like? Which are good things, like you want to know how to be a good leader, but then to actually make stuff happen, you have to know, like, okay, some basic skill that actually does something, like whether that's like I program a computer to do this, you know. It's very hard to like go into a job and say like I have good leadership skills, because it doesn't like directly, unless you've built yourself up through something else, like, you know, programming is kind of my route, like, you know, programming, or if you're, you know, like, I don't know what else, but kind of go through that way where it's more applicable, and then the leadership stuff comes into play, because then you're managing people, but you have to first use your skills, whether that's, you know, programming, whether that's like writing, whether that's, you know, sales, whatever it is, you know what I mean?
Sure. So the question you're asking, I guess, is what type of what type of education is being offered out there? Is that the question you're asking?
That was a very long-winded question that I forgot I was asking, but I'm asking.
Yeah, no. Well, and I don't really know all the way. Like, I don't really know what he's studying.
Well, cause here's my question. So like, let's go down the it's an education problem. Okay, that seems to be like, if we can fix like some piece of education where they know it's the teaching the man to fish, right?
Yeah.
You know, is the education how to be a good leader? Like, is it very like big and abstract stuff that we should be teaching other things? Like, should we be teaching more like, here's how to, you know, do accounting, or, you know, like I have no idea what the needs are in Africa, so I'm just kind of making stuff up, but like,
yeah.
You know what I mean?
Well, I think that can be just a really great kind of discussion topic, as far as like, even here, like what kind of education is the most applicable.
Yeah, absolutely.
I honestly, like, my experiences, I think that conceptual education is so important, even if it's just like, and like, oh, how to be a good leader. That has its place, and it doesn't have its place. You know, it depends. But I think even like a high school general education is so valuable. I found when I lived abroad, it was interesting how I felt like I was on a different plane of just intellectualism and education, and it wasn't because I'm just, you know, smarter. I would never say anything like that. I am definitely not. I'm not even above average here. Like, I'm just a normal guy. And so
humble,
for me,
my friend.
What?
You're too humble.
No, I am definitely not that smart of a guy. And so it was so interesting when I talked to people, and people that have a hard time conceptualizing things, and, you know, concepts were hard for people. I realized that education and how you grow up is such an important thing. If you spend your whole life really just kind of breaking rocks and making the same kind of food, and, you know, just taking care of day-to-day tasks to survive, then your ability to conceptualize is not going to be as high. And I think even here, it's valuable to talk about things that maybe don't even have exact practical applications, just A, to, you know, understand the world better, and B, to be able to better conceptualize things. I mean, school is not about learning how to do exact things so you can survive. I mean, stuff like doing your taxes really isn't that hard if you just go to TurboTax and type in your information. Like, it's
easy.
You don't need a class generally to teach you how to do that. It would probably be nice. But the real
I actually think there should be. I think it's crazy that there's not.
I think there should be,
know?
but I don't think that you need a class, at least right now, to tell you everything that you practically have to do
about
because
the tax code.
Yeah. You have to learn how to conceptualize and how to problem solve.
Yeah.
And how to jump through hoops. And then you can figure out how to do your taxes, because the electronic system's going to change.
The tax system's going to change.
Yeah.
Heck, it changed in the past year.
Yeah, it's true.
As I was talking with my own tax accountant, because I did a couple of weeks ago just did my own for 2020.
Yeah.
And heck, even as they were doing stuff, they were like, okay, give us a second, because we're still discovering the changes that they made when, you know, the Biden administration took over. There was a whole different system that they had for how you claim dependencies and your allowances.
Accountants, man.
Oh, R.I.P. man.
To all you accountants out there, mad respect.
Bless your
I
souls.
could not do it
At this time of year.
Never.
Yeah.
Nope. As far as education goes, I worry that we lose sight of the value of that within the States, because the way that we conceptualize, especially something like a university degree, to me, it's worrying me how in some cases it can be debt-laden Pleasure Island, and When originally, I think the whole idea of having a university was to become a Renaissance man. It's not a training ground. It should not be a training ground for some type of career. It should be to tell you how to think, or to teach you how to become a thinker. And originally, that's what the idea of the university was. It was the idea of the Renaissance man was that you had a half-decent exposure to all of these different realms of life.
Yeah.
You knew about music and culture and art. You also knew about biology and some of the more recent discoveries that we had. Chemistry. History, which we've done an appalling job of in the United States. I'm fascinated by...
Tell me about one piece of Asian history that you know, that you've learned throughout school.
Zero.
You've learned zero about,
What is even the percentage of Americans that recognize the name of Mao?
Yeah.
I'll bet it's minuscule.
It's probably less than 2%.
It's got to be. It's got to be something like that. And I've done some minimal research into, like, I know a little bit more about Russian history, how the Russian Revolution began, how Lenin took power and then transferred over to Stalin, and then the Kulags, the eventual destruction of the USSR into what is modern day Russia and all of its satellite states. I've done that. I don't know much about, like, Asian history because I haven't delved into that, but of that.
Asia's like 2/3 of the world.
At least.
Yeah.
Right? Like, how on... We just don't know.
Yeah.
And I'm curious about, at what point did the university stop being what it was supposed to be? Because they keep trying to be things they're not, and they're trying to... it's boggling to me.
Yeah,
it's like stuck between two different things, and it doesn't know what it should be anymore.
Well, it's a weird issue because it's like university is becoming so... It's so, like, overpriced and bloated with stuff that's just, I pay, like, thousands of dollars to go learn about whatever. All this random stuff that, classical music, which I think it's good to know about classical music. Is it worth, like, $2,000 to take a class on classical music? Probably not, if that's not my degree. You know what I mean?
I'm caught between agreeing and disagreeing with you, because I feel like that's what a university thing should be. But the problem is we're all trying to use it like it's training us to do a job.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. So here's where I don't disagree with that, but I know a lot of people, like, I come from a more practical frame that I'm like, okay, yeah, it's good. I definitely see the strength in knowing a lot of different areas. That's one of the prime traits that that really good entrepreneurs have, is they're able to take ideas from all of these different realms and apply different concepts. So, like, take one of my favorite entrepreneurs, Elon Musk. He was able to take a lot of concepts that he learned from, his background in physics and economics and stuff, and figure out a way to build an electric vehicle that was appealing to people. Well, he couldn't have done that if he didn't combine a lot of different arenas to do that. And so there's definitely utility in doing that. The annoying thing and the frustration that I find is that it's not, at least at the university level, is you're paying all this money, but, like, the concepts just aren't, like, super applicable. So, when I'm taking the classical music class, it's like, okay, well, I don't really care who this composer was at this time. Like, sorry if you really like classical music. Actually, you guys like classical music, don't you?
Yeah.
All right, so I just offended everyone in this room.
Maybe.
Oh, well, too bad. Disruptive discussions, guys. So I just don't care about classical music, there's just not, like, how are you going to apply that? There's not really any, and maybe the point isn't to apply that.
See, I feel like that's exactly it. The
now,
problem is
now to finish my point really quick
before you go for it.
To finish my point, there have been classes that I have taken that still follow the approach that you're talking about, where it's very, problem solving, but it's applied problem solving, where, our capstone class that you're taking it this semester, I've taken it. You're actually going out to businesses, you're finding out what their problems are, and you're coming up with solutions that you've learned throughout school, pulling from all of the different areas that you've learned from to actually build them something. I want to see more of the building and applying part. Does that make sense?
Yes. See, and here's where I have to agree with you the most is the fact that what the university was, what the university should be, and what it is are three very different things. Yeah. That's the distinction that I have to make. What the university was, when it became a more common thing, was something abstract. It wasn't supposed to be something applicable, at least not directly. Like, we go to the Huntsman School of Business. A university was never meant to be, here's how we're going to teach you Python coding, because it's going to be a very useful skill to have. The university was study how to think.
Yeah, philosophy.
Let's dig a little bit into philosophy. The Socratic method. How should you ask questions to discover knowledge? Let's apply that to chemistry. Let's apply different skills to different mediums. Mm-hmm. That's how we developed the scientific method. And through all of that, you created your own thesis, and that's what you did. That's why the Oxford Scholar is something in history that's always been just such a prime example of someone who knows what they're doing, because they're a Renaissance man. They know a little bit about classical music. If you took them onto a dance floor, they could probably dance with a partner. We couldn't do that right now. No, mosh pit style. That's all we got. But they could recognize a waltz, and they could do that, or they could have some sort of half-literate discussion on chemistry, or the expansion of viruses in biology. Mm-hmm. That is the type of thing we've started to lose, because the university has become a commonplace thing, in my opinion, to the point where it's just, you're not competitive in today's market if you don't have some type of degree.
It's a conceptual trade school.
Yes, that's what it started to try to breed itself with. The problem is that we're stuck halfway between the two, and it doesn't do either of them very well. Because I feel that a lot of the conceptual classes that I've taken, as a young guy, obviously some of them you start to look at and go, gosh, why am I learning this? I'm never going to use this. You were never supposed to directly use it. The university has always had these topics because you should, as a good citizen, be somewhat knowledgeable about how biology works. Mm-hmm. I still believe that's true. Otherwise, fake news can spread very quickly, people. And boy, oh boy, have we seen how that ruins things quite quickly when people are too stupid to understand what they're talking about.
Yeah. COVID-19 is real, just an FYI.
Yeah.
Not saying that. I was not indirectly pointing to some sort of farce.
Yeah.
But people do not have intelligent discussions because they went through their biology classes and didn't pay attention. Yeah. They don't know what they're talking about.
That is a very good point.
That's why, in my opinion, it's important for us as a culture, if not always as individuals, to have a good understanding of all of the basic topics. Mm. The problem is that we've also tried to make it to the point where it should be training. I need to learn Python. I need to learn some basics of accounting. How can I manage general ledgers? How should I make a legal decision when I'm trying to write a contract? These are really great skills to know, but it's not exactly what a university used to be. Probably is what it should be in the future, and we need to have a better way of putting the two together. But we're still in the growing pains stages. Yeah. And that's where I feel like we're overpaying for something that doesn't know what it is right now.
Yeah. You'd almost have to, if I were to design a university, this is how I would design it. So I think I've reneged my position a little bit. I think you're dead on with, the way universities used to be is it wasn't to have any technically applicable knowledge. It was to have a very broad idea of how the world works in a lot of different arenas.
At a conceptual level. I over-summarized a lot to keep it tight. Yeah. But, yeah.
But so I'm in this program right now, the Center for Anticipatory Intelligence, where, a lot of the stuff that we do is very much at that very high level, but very broad perspective, where we're talking about, geopolitical struggles in the Middle East, combined with these different technological advancements. Well, none of us are like really in this group that I'm in. None of us really know in depth how this applies to our situation, right? Nor that's not the purpose of the program. The purpose of the program is to create this awareness of these are the issues going on. How can we, use these knowledge and resources to create, a meaningful analysis for people who know these better, And so I come from the perspective, the program's really cool because it's built so it's really diverse, where I come from the perspective of I'm the IT guy, where I know computers, I know programming, I know how different business systems work, whereas we have other people who are from different backgrounds, and we're able to combine our knowledge and be able to come up with meaningful conversations to really analyze situations from a lot of different perspectives. So the way I would build like a university, if I had to build a university, is I would kind of have that aspect of it, where maybe you do that for like, and I think this is what universities try to do, but like I think people just aren't enthusiastic about it. Maybe, I don't know. I'm just kind of thinking out loud right now. I would kind of have that as kind of the base level, where you're looking at these problems from a really wide perspective, but really analyzing them and really working with people who have in industry knowledge in it, or be able to get different perspectives. But then kind of like on the tail end of it, do like a lot more like capstone focus type of stuff, where it's like, okay, we're going to take these things, but we're going to actually apply it now by doing a project with a real company or a real organization, where we're going to apply something and we're going to create something based on what we learned and based on the resources that we have now that we're able to tap into. I think that's how, at least at a Caden's very I'm sure there's a lot of problems with that, but
see, I like that thought that you have kind of about broadening the conception of it. One thing I like that you pointed out is about your program, how it seems like there's a diverse group of people, but it seems more focused on like why it's important, and it seems kind of almost a lot like free-form discussion kind of focused.
Yeah.
One of my problems is that the education system we have has taken the joy out of learning. And so I'm literally, I was sitting in this class, some political science kind of class, and I was listening. I was like, wow, this is so interesting. This is so cool. I'm going to have to really study this when I get out of this class.
Yup.
And think about that for a second. Think about that. I'm in a class.
Felt that.
To learn some aspect of political development. And I think this was actually my development class that I'm taking. And so I was like, wow, what an interesting lecture. I can't wait to actually learn about it.
Oh, man.
Now, I'm not saying... Now, I'm going to put in a plug here. My professor is wonderful. Like she is so great. And the lectures are awesome. Like, I really, really enjoy them. And I'm not complaining about how the class is structured. But I think a lot of it is the university system, which requires just such a degree of quantification. And you have to pass the class with an A or a B or a C, and then it has to translate now into monetary value. And it just takes, for me, it takes a lot of the joy out of learning that I would otherwise get from picking up a book because I want to learn. And then you just read that book because you're just interested what's inside of it. And so I'm the kind of guy, like I will pick up a book and read it just for fun about like education. Like I love, nonfiction books about politics and business and technology, but it's hard for me to motivate myself to really study that stuff if it's so, if it's so rigid and structured like the university system. And obviously you need the rigidity and the structure for it to really make a mark in your marketability and your ability to get a job and show that you understand something. But I wish there was a way to take the joy of learning back into school.
What you just said brought to mind, because I think we all three of us probably had to take the same class from John Ferguson for business law.
Yep.
I know his biggest problem that he absolutely hates with how the university runs things is the fact that it grades things. Like, he hates the fact that students are judged based on a certain criterion from 0 to 100 that's labeled with A, B, C, D, E, F. Or, we don't have an E, actually. I just noticed that.
No.
We don't have an E grade. Why does it go
where
straight
have you
to...
been, Nick? Jeez.
A B C
That's
D F.
curious. A, B, C, D, F. Yeah, well, I mean, I guess
That
it
is
stands
kinda
for
weird.
fail. Sure. I guess we just have A through D, and then you fail.
Or maybe it's
That's
flipping
what it
awesome.
is.
Fail.
Flip.
Flipping awesome.
Get to take it
Nice.
again.
Yeah.
Pain. Yikes. And I know he was saying, I get it, because you have to have a very rigid structure for grading, because that's how you compare students against each other. And that's the quantification of type of things is the reason we do it that way. He goes, I get it, and I have to go along with it because no one else will follow me along yet. But if he was going to design a university, like you kind of mentioned, he wouldn't do it that way. He would do it in a way where students would have projects, students would have very subjective things, and they would work with a professor to develop results on some sort of thing, whatever it is. And it would be a very subjective thing. Mm-hmm. Did the student learn the thing? You know what I mean? And you can't quantify the degree to which a student learned a thing, but the student would in fact learn something much more than they did, and I think that would put the fun back into it. But that I think that's where, at least for me, I feel that the stress from school comes from understanding that on a quantifiable scale, I have to be above a certain X benchmark in order to do A, well, or B, well enough to pass. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So there's this thing. I was just pulling up some of my notes here. This reminded me of this. So in one of my business classes, it was like an IT leadership class. Funny enough, talking about leadership. This is actually pretty applicable to kind of what we're talking about. Is like they did like this big study, basically about like what motivates people in the workplace, and I think somebody gave a TED talk on this too. And so they looked at it and they were like, okay, well, kind of our theory at first is, if you pay somebody more is going to get done. And so, you bring that over into our schooling example, if you're graded on it, you're going to do better work, and kind of generally speaking, that's kind of true, but only to a certain extent. The bigger factors that come into play is what they found when they did this study with compensation is people were doing things outside of work that they weren't, getting paid for. Obviously, like, people have hobbies that they're really into, whether it's like weightlifting or, exercise is a big one for me. People have all sorts of hobbies that they're into. And what they found was that there's basically three main areas that people are actually really motivated by. And those three areas are what they call autonomy, which is basically like the freedom to kind of make your own decisions and kind of explore and kind of do things kind of how you want. That's a big motivator. The next one is having a strong purpose. So you see this a lot with like people who work like in the government for like the FBI or like the CIA or something. They don't necessarily take home the best pay, but I mean that's a really purpose-driven career. You're helping save lives and really like quite literally making a large difference in society by serving in those organizations. So purpose is another one. And then the last one is mastery, just like getting really, really good at something that is like semi-predictable, like when you go to, program this code, at the end of the day, you can make progress on it. You can build an application, or when you're doing your weightlifting, there's a progression to it, which really motivates people too. And so I thought it was interesting that, when you're in the workplace, that is what tends to motivate people the most, aside from compensation. You have to compensate people up to a point where they're not worried about it. Once they're not worried about it, then their primary motivators change to those three things: autonomy, mastery, and purpose, which I thought was interesting.
That is amazing. No, that makes a lot of sense too.
Yeah, I learned that. I was like starting to think about it. I'm like, yeah,
nope, that's true.
That's how I operate. I'm like,
yep.
Well, yeah, it's the idea. Like, if you really want to motivate your workers, don't just pay them more. Like, we'll give you more to work even harder, but give them a why. If you explain to them how people's lives are becoming better because of the work that you're doing, you're going to work so much harder.
And I think it's different based on like each person. Like, I'm talking, we kind of veered off. I'm talking more about the workplace now. We were kind of talking about making learning more exciting, but I think
it's the same idea.
I think it totally depends on like the person, and that really comes down to like, taking responsibility if you're in a position of like leadership, of being there and making sure that the people who you're supporting as a leader are in the right positions and doing the right things that they like to do, because a lot of that falls onto you as their manager, as their supervisor, into making sure that they are thriving, whether they're really motivated by autonomy or motivated by mastery or whatever it is, putting them in a position where they have more of that. And that's when you see employees like really take off with it, at least for my small conceptualization of the world and the way it works.
Mm-hmm. No, it makes sense. And I can even offer just a quick small example that's also rather personal too. I mean, I was telling you about like about a year ago now, I started working in IT over at Campbell Scientific.
That's so
it's been a year.
Weird that it's been a year.
It is crazy to think it's been that long, right? It's been one heck of a year. It's been a productive one, I'll call it that.
Yeah.
But I remember it very first because I was a bit confused as to when I started learning a lot of things, kind of just dug right into the job with as far as help desk goes, helping out people with a lot of different requests. But I found that I was surprised by how much autonomy I had from our manager in the department, Jeff.
Yeah.
Which at first I kind of worried because like, hey, why am I not being like so overly managed or anything? I probably noticed it a lot because I had been in a number of positions recently that had been severely overmanaged.
Well, and if you ask most people, like, so in that class, sorry, quick side tangent, that was good. We did like a survey of like, what was your best job? What were kind of the features of your best job you've had? And what are the features of the worst job you had? Mm-hmm. And like, the top thing was, being micromanaged, having annoying managers. That autonomy wasn't there.
Right. I've been in positions where it just chokes you out of wanting to do anything with that job because it just feels overbearing.
Yeah.
But I noticed the freedom that I had when I went to somewhere like Campbell Scientific. And because of that freedom, I also felt really compelled to just make as much progress as I could.
Yeah.
Because I could do that.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? And it led into all the types of side projects that kind of turned into really good things that I just probably never would have done if I had been kind of overly managed on that sort of thing. Instead of just doing help desk stuff, I also, I stay after hours and I dug into SQL Server and really developed a whole new system that is in the middle of trying to be implemented and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
I wouldn't have had the chance to do that if I didn't have the autonomy to explore that on my own.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And I was flabbergasted by that.
Well,
and when you said that, I was like, oh yeah, it's because that one specific little thing. That's kind of cool.
And you can kind of see like those other two areas come into play too, where you have the mastery, where it's like, okay, you're building this license project you're basically building a program to track licenses. That's kind of the mastery aspect, where it's like, okay, let's figure this out. Let's build this.
It's at the edge of my realm.
Yeah,
I've got enough of it that I know what I'm doing.
Exactly, and
enough of it that I really don't know, and I have to learn to do a lot of the stuff that needs to be done. Yeah,
yeah, and so it's interesting when you those are the three motivators.
So if I can kind of round this out from my kind of perspective, it seems like everyone has a certain degree of potential that is pretty much just unlocked. And it seems like it's largely unlocked because of a lot of the other rigid kind of structures that keep it contained almost. And it seems like really developing a passion for something and having autonomy to really explore it, to grow, to develop, and make a positive difference. And to see that positive difference is the real important thing. And that, I guess, applies in education, and it applies in the workforce. I mean, as we're talking, I remember like over the summer listening to podcasts about World War I. I listened to like 24 hours worth of podcasts, and I was just like enthralled with it, and I was studying it, and I was looking things up on my free time, and it was fun because it was me doing it and because I wanted it and because it was interesting and I could relate it to the real world today. And it seems like the real key is how do you take passion or how do you make it passionate for people if you're a manager in a job, or if you're a professor at university, or even if you're a teacher in college, in high school? How do you unlock that potential and just passion and love for something and that autonomy for those that you help? And I don't really know the answer to it, but I think that should be the real question, rather than how do we get X amount of productivity, or how do we get like X amount of students passing with this grade, or placed into these kind of jobs. I think that should be the real question.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah, and I'm not sure the answer to that question, but I think you're right too.
And we've all been there where something just takes you, but it's
well, you know what? You know what's funny when you look at things from that perspective too. When you hear universities saying like, "Hey, we have like the highest job placement," well, if the job placement is at places where people hate working, I mean, you think about it, that's like, hold on just a second, Talking about skew the data. So for like, highest pay might actually not be what you're looking for, which I know, crazy concept for Americans where everything's work centered, but no, that's a good point, and I think that's a really tough question to answer. I have no idea how you would go about it. I think half of it is on. I mean, it's everybody's different. That's what makes it so challenging, especially in a classroom setting. I would think the first approach would be have a setting where everybody genuinely wants to be there. I think that helps. Where if you have some kind of process that's like you have to weed out the people that are not committed to a learning environment like that, or a working environment, or whatever, so then they're dedicated, they're committed to that process of like finding that passion, because they have it, because otherwise they wouldn't have gone through the process to be there in the first place. I think that's where you could begin with it.
Well, and I think also people have to be able to make an impact themselves, and they have to be able to grow themselves, because you can tell someone something all that you want, but if you let them discover it, then it's different. And if you let them have discussions that aren't too high level for just like a reasonable student to participate in it, but are also not so easy that anyone off the street can just kind of come in and understand everything, I think you have to facilitate those discussions, and you have to leave it open and autonomous enough that people can really kind of interactively discover on their own how something is important.
They feel like they can meaningfully contribute without feeling too dumb.
Yeah. Well, and that's where I honestly don't believe there's hardly any classes that should be purely lecture based. You listen to what the professor says, just try to get it inside your mind, and then take some kind of exam to arbitrarily say you understand this for the next 24 hours at least. Yeah. I think there's no. I don't think any class belongs in that at that point, and I'm kind of tired of a lot of times where I see people be kind of lazy about their approach with things and just take an easy lecture based format and low interactivity, because you're really not doing anything. No one's going to learn. No one's going to care.
Yeah, especially with COVID, like all the online recorded classes.
Oh, yeah.
Not that that's anyone's fault in particular, because our world is just in a weird circumstance. Mm-hmm. But I can't it was like the last half of the semester I graduated, it all went to online, and I can remember a little bit of what I learned, but I couldn't tell you a whole lot, man. Like when everything went online, it was just like, okay, watch the video, and it was just so far removed from everything that there just wasn't really any meaningful discussion or memorable things from it, I guess.
Can confirm, my guy. Yep. That's what my last year's been like too, and I just don't. Now maybe I'm biased too, but I like learning that way. I like learning in group settings, where you have people around you, you do it together.
Yeah.
It's
where you
very
discuss
interactive.
ideas and
kind
of brainstorm back and forth.
Well, and I think honestly, I hate the whole COVID cop out because you can actually do it. Like, I think it's a bunch of baloney to say you can't do things. There's things that work better on Zoom than in person. To be honest,
you know what? That's true.
And
Right.
I've had
some things do. Yeah,
and I've
that's
had
actually
some
true.
professors that have just thrown the cop out card. Oh, I know it's hard with COVID. Well, it is hard with COVID, but I've had others that have made excellent discussions and have brought guest speakers in from other countries because you know what? It's a lot easier over Zoom than it is in person to have everyone watch a screen and try to interact with it. You can interact with a screen much better if you're over Zoom, and you can go into breakout rooms like that. I think that no matter the circumstances, discussion and self-discovery are the most important things as a student, because otherwise your class has no value or meaning in my life, no matter how interested I am innately in the topic.
Yes.
I liked that is a very good point about COVID, is that it is normalized remote discussion, which actually I'm really glad you brought that up, because like a lot of the group projects I've worked on, they've actually been easier to work on because you just do them over Zoom. You just send a Zoom link and boom, you're there. You have your discussion. Everybody's, at their home office. You have your own setup that you're working on, It's actually super easy. So I think there are people that kind of use COVID as a cop out of,
It's hard.
It's hard time in these trying times, like, yeah, they're trying, but like you can still, put an effort in.
Yeah, just set things up in a way that's going to make sense.
But I'll tell you what,
I
I have been absolutely amazed at the good job that a lot of the university staff have done. Not everyone's done a great job, but a good majority, at least of the professors I've had, they've done a really good job at adapting to it and actually making it a really enjoyable learning experience despite all of the crap that's going on in the world.
I wish I could say the same for most of. So I've had some good ones, but I wish I could say the same for others.
Yeah, it's just different depending on who you have.
Yeah.
So, yeah, weird times.
It's true.
Solving the education system.
I think that's a good solid spot. Does that sound good to you guys?
Yeah.
I feel like we kind of hit a natural lull there anyway.
Yeah.
Cool.
Okay.
Okay.